In this video, we're going to be looking at the basics of baking in PBR Painter. So there's a bunch of things you can do in terms of baking in PBR Painter, and this video is aimed at beginners who are just getting started with baking in PBR Painter. So as I said, there's different ways that you can use baking. One of the main ways is to export your material, and this is what we're going to start with in this video. So in other words, when you build your layered material and then you want to take all of those different layers and create images from the different channels, this is where baking comes in. And then you can do things like export your material and use it in other programs. So I'm going to demonstrate that now by making a very simple material and then baking down the channels into a set of images. So I'm going to create a new layer and just start adding some different things to these channels. So I'll give it a color and then maybe a metallic and then a roughness as well. And maybe normals as well. And then I'm going to add a mask to this layer just to add some variation across the mesh. And I might bump the normals so that we've got some normals coming through as well. Okay, so this is a very simple one layer material, but all the concepts I'm going to show now apply for any number of layers that you could create. So once you're at the point where you're happy with your material and you want to bake it, you can jump across to the baking tab. And this is where you'll find everything you need to do that baking. Before I start actually talking about the baking process, I'm going to point out a couple of these different items at the top here. So number one is that you can save and load or remove any of the configurations that you set up within your baking tab. And these will get saved to the add-on preferences, which is persistent across different Blender sessions. So you can save your favorite configurations using this save option in here. And then you can then load it in later on using this drop down. So this is really useful if you have a particular baking workflow that you want to use over and over again. For example, for a particular type of export. You can also specify whether the settings in here come from the scene. So you can have scene level settings or from a specific material. So if you choose material, then everything you set up in here will be specific to each material that you work with. So in general, this is set to scene by default so that you don't have to redo all of these settings every time you want to work with a new material. Okay, so looking underneath these settings here, there's three main groups of settings. So there's the general settings, there's mesh maps, which we're not going to talk about in this video. I'm going to leave that for a different video. And then the thing that we're after for this video is material exporting. So before I go into that, I'm going to open up general settings and just quickly go through some of these. So in here, you can do things like specify your normal format. So by default, this is set to OpenGL, but you can also specify that as DirectX as well. You can choose to automatically overwrite existing images or textures. So when you're exporting your different channels as your different PBR textures, you can just automatically overwrite those. When you're exporting your materials, all of your different channels, so the base color, metallic, roughness, all of those different channels will get given a different name based on some convention. So this option here is basically whether or not you want to include the resolution. So example here is 4K at the end of that name. So I'm not going to change that for the sake of this video, but you can modify that. Another way to modify the naming of images, and again, I'm not going to go into that for this video, is you can actually use a custom configuration. So you can actually specify exactly how you want your baked images to be named. The final option in here that's important is that you can choose to save your textures or your images externally. So if we say yes, we can then specify a directory and these other settings in here that's going to determine how those images are baked. The other thing you can do at this point, if I go into the add-on preferences, under the image saving preferences in here, you can change the default saving method for images in PBR Painter. So this is something I mentioned in an earlier video, but essentially this determines the default behavior for all of your different images that are created or modified within PBR Painter. If we set this to save externally, you can set it to a subdirectory, which is only going to work if you actually have your file saved, or an absolute directory if you want to. But if we, for the sake of this example, set that to a subdirectory, we can set all of the different format settings in here. And then you'll see when we go to the baking, you can actually tick use add-on preferences. And this is going to copy all of those settings in there. So if you want to use that workflow, you can. Otherwise, you can turn that off and then you can specify the settings in here. So for the sake of this video, I'm going to use the preferences and that will save my images to that subdirectory. So that's all I'm going to go into in terms of those settings. Now I'm going to go straight to material exporting. And here I'm going to specify my resolution. So I'm going to leave it at 4K. So you have a quick way of selecting resolutions in here, or you can specify them individually. The margin, I'm going to leave at 16 pixels, which is basically how the baked pixels are going to extend outwards from the UV edges. The bake samples I can leave at 1. The main reason you want to increase this is if you're working with things like ambient occlusion nodes or bevel nodes in your material and you actually need more samples to make sure they render without too much noise. You can increase this if you want to. You can specify which UV map. So if you have multiple different UV maps for this same mesh, you can choose which one you want to go to. And this is a general feature of PBR Painter, is that you can have different UV maps that you use for different scenarios. The other thing that's important in here is we can create an exportable material. When you tick this, what's going to happen is when it bakes down the images, it's going to create a new material in Blender, and it's going to put those images in that material in such a way that that can then be exported. So I'm going to leave that one as create new, and that's going to create a new material. You can choose to turn on the fake user for that material so that it doesn't get lost. For example, if you save and exit Blender. And then the final thing that you can do before I click bake is you can determine how you're going to select the channels. So by default, this is set to automatic, which means that it's just going to look at all of your layers, figure out which channels are used, and then it's just going to bake those channels. So that's useful if you want a quick and easy way to just bake everything that you need automatically. As an alternative, you can set this to manual, and then you can actually select exactly which channels that you want to bake. Something else you can do with manual is you can turn on channel packing, but I'm not going to talk about that in this video because that's going to be saved for a more advanced video. So for now, I'm just going to put this at automatic and I'm going to click bake. When you click bake, you'll see that there's this option to bake all selected objects to a single material, which is not turned on at the moment because I'm only selecting one object. Again, this is something for a different video, but basically this is going to let you bake multiple objects into the same set of images, which is really useful for specific workflows. But for now, I don't need that, so I'm going to click OK. So now what it's doing is it's just going through those different channels and it's baking one at a time. So it's baked the image for the color. Now it's baking the metallic. Now it's baking the roughness. And then finally those normals. So because I specified to save externally, these images, which you can see down here, now have file paths and they've been saved to this subdirectory. And you can see that they've been given this standard name, which is basically by default, it's going to be the name of the mesh followed by the channel, followed by the resolution. And this is where you can go into this settings here and you can actually change these into something more custom. All right, so what we can do now is we can actually have a look at that material that was baked. So this material here, as I said, is the same thing, it's just with those baked images. So it looks basically the same. Depending on the resolution that you specify and other settings, you might get a slight difference between this material and the one you started with. To actually see what's happened in terms of this material, I'm going to go across to the shading tab or the shader editor. And you can see now what it's done is it's just added all these different image texture nodes and it's added the baked images into these nodes. So as I said, this is now in a standard format for this kind of material in Blender. So that means that the normal workflows for exporting and saving models with materials is then possible using this kind of exportable material. So very valuable when you're creating those materials to use outside of Blender. All right, so I'm going to pull this one down again. And I want to showcase two more things before I wrap the video up. So I'm going to go back to my PBR Painter material now. So those two things are number one, merging. So this is going to merge your layers into a single layer. And number two, baking masks. So starting with the merging, when you've got more than one layer, so I can just add another layer like this. And I'm just going to turn on the normal channel for this layer. And I'm just going to do something like create a procedural effect just so that I can show how these kind of blend together. And so I'm going to combine the normals and then put the strength down a lot. So now we've got this kind of overlapping of these two different normal effects. So what I can now do is go across to baking, back to material exporting, and now I can click this merge option. And this is going to do the same basic thing, but it's now going to merge those layers into one layer. So in this case, you're given the option to back up the current material. So I'm going to click OK. So again, it's now doing that baking. And now if I go across to my layers, what it's actually done is taken all those layers and create this single merged layer. And within this layer, it's now added these images directly as image textures. So this is really useful if you're working with many different layers and you want to merge things as you go, because this is going to help to speed up the rendering of the material and reduce the computational load of that rendering. Okay, so the final thing I'm going to go through quickly is baking masks. So for this, I'm just going to add a new mask again. And this is very straightforward. There's just an option to bake the selected mask. So whenever you have a mask selected, you can then bake it. And again, we're just going to specify the resolution of that mask to whatever you want, and the same settings here as well. So again, with the bake samples, if you're baking something like an ambient occlusion mask or something that uses an ambient occlusion node, you may want to increase this to something higher, but I'm going to leave it at 1 for the sake of this mask. And so that's just going to bake that mask and give me an image as the result. It's just going to hide the original mask just in case you want to reuse that or you want to redo the baking. But if you're happy with the baking, you can then just remove that one. So this is a really useful tool because a lot of the time these masks might need cycles, for example. And so you can bake them into an image so then you can use them within Eevee. With masks, you can also do a similar thing to layers and you can merge all your visible masks. So again, if I add another procedural mask like this, and now if I just preview the whole mask stack, this is what it looks like. So I can then merge these together to create a single mask with this joined effect like this. So again, I click OK. So now it's baking all of the masks together. And again, the result is a single mask with an image with both of those effects, and it's just hidden these other 2 layers as well. So again, you can delete these if you're happy with that baking. That's everything I wanted to cover in this video. As I said, there'll be other videos covering some of the more advanced concepts, but this video is enough to get started and to understand a lot of what's happening in terms of that baking in PBR Painter. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching and I'll catch you in another video. Cheers.